we are going to start our unit on the muscular system. And the muscular system is an extremely important component of the human body because it's what allows us to do something imperative to survival, which is movement. So this first lecture, we're just going to start and take a look at just what are the components that make up an actual muscle itself. So we're just going to dive a little bit into the anatomy of a muscle. We're not going to get into functionality or anything just yet. So let's get started. Okay, so first thing, when you have a muscle, the whole point of a muscle is movement. And in order for movement to happen, the muscle has to actually be attached to something, right? So for example, if I want to play tug of war with somebody and I'm holding one end of my rope and nobody ever goes and picks up the other end, it's not going to be a very compelling game of tug of war. I'm just going to pull and nothing's going to happen. And that's how muscles work. Muscles have to attach to bone in order for movement to occur. So a muscle attaches to a bone with a piece of connective tissue known as a tendon. And we learned all about connective tissue in the unit on tissues, obviously. And we learned that that is dense, regular connective tissue. So tendons are made up of pretty much all collagen, all running the same direction, and they are extremely strong. And they are built to be able to resist the force of a muscle pulling on a bone. Now, on the outside of a muscle, when you think of a muscle, we're going to use, like, for example, if you take a look over here, this would be an example of a muscle. This is a femur, so this would be one of the quadricep muscles that would make up what you would consider to be your quads, obviously. And if you take a look here, you can see this muscle actually has some components to it, and we're going to talk all about that. How are these different components named, and what are they actually made up of? But the first thing I'll point out to you is that this is kind of all bundled together. It looks kind of like a head of garlic, if you've ever seen a head of garlic before, or like an onion, you know, something along those lines. And on the outside of this muscle is this tissue called fascia. And fascia is made up of connective tissue, and it is essentially what allows our muscles to become independent functional groups from each other. So for example, when you think of an organism, there's not one muscle. There's many muscles all layered on top of each other. And then the way those muscles contract in different ways allows for movement. And they're going to shift over top of each other. And one of the things that we need in order to prevent our muscles from growing into each other is this fascia layer. So what that does is this outermost layer of the muscle, it covers the entire muscle, and it actually is continuous with the tendon. So it becomes the tendon. So it's made up of the same components. It's all collagen. So you can see in this image here, the fascia extends off of the muscle into the tendon and attaches to the bone. And its main purpose is really to essentially make the boundaries up of that muscle, because all muscles made up of the same components. So the only thing separating one from another is this fascia covering and the direction of those fibers. So it's extremely important. And actually what ends up happening is that fascia continues to grow because it's made up of cells, right? So that is why in the morning you feel stiff. If you've ever slept in a certain position, when you wake up in the morning, it feels really good to stretch. And the reason why it feels good to stretch is because that fascia is actually growing into itself, and your muscles are actually starting to fuse together. Now, will they ever completely fuse? I don't think so. But if you were to be immobile for days, over that time, your muscles will start to tighten up, and you will have a hard time moving. And you have to literally stretch those muscle fibers to break that fascia to get your movement back. The last term on this slide is something called aponeurosis. And aponeurosis is it's a little bit unique. There's only a handful of spots in the human body where this exists. And aponeurosis is when muscle connects to other muscle. So if you look in the corner here, you can see the abdominal muscle. This would be an example of an aponeurosis. So most of our muscles attach muscle to bone, and then the bone, when the muscle contracts, the bone moves. Aponeurosis is when muscle fibers attach to other muscle fibers. So the six-pack muscle. What you're seeing when you see a six-pack, a well-defined six-pack, is you're seeing the individual muscle bundles being held together by aponeurosis. So that's just a term you need to be familiar with. Okay, let's keep moving through this. So muscle is broken down into layers in terms of bundles of fibers, and there are some coverings that keep these separate from each other. So these are membranes. So we're talking epithelial tissue, right? We talked all about this in that tissue unit. And if you take a look here, I would say, I don't know if you agree with me, but this looks kind of like an orange. So I'm going to use an orange as an analogy because we've all peeled an orange before, so we can kind of relate to this. So there are essentially several layers when you're looking at a muscle. So this would be a muscle here. And a muscle is made up of thousands and thousands, millions of individual muscle fibers. And those individual muscle fibers are the muscle cells. So each muscle fiber is a muscle cell. But they're bundled together in these different segments. So let's go through that now. So the first layer of covering or membrane is called the epimysium or epimysium. I say epimysium, but you might hear it said epimysium. These are one of those terms that, depending on who says it, you might hear a different way to say it. And that is going to be the outermost membrane that covers the entire muscle, so that it surrounds the entire muscle, and that's going to be found under the fascia. So if you were to peel back the fascia, the first layer is going to be that epimysium. And then underneath that layer, you have bundles of muscle. And muscle actually gets bundled together in these things called fascicles. So think of these fascicles as individual bundles of muscle fibers within a muscle. So these would be fascicles. So this would be one fascicle here. This would be one fascicle here. And there's a membrane surrounding those called the perimysium or perimysium. And then finally, each individual muscle cell, which is a fiber, is going to be covered by its own layer of fiber called the endomysium. And underneath that is what is called the sarcolemma. So let me just show it to you in a diagram here that might make some sense. So as you can see, I did a little bit of artwork. Don't judge me on my art. It's not that impressive, but it'll do the job. So if you take a look here, what we have is what you just looked at essentially. This would be one full muscle. And we have the epimysium would be the outer, this would be the fascia on top. And then below that we have our epimysium, our perimysium, and our endomysium. So let's take a look at our orange here. So if we have our orange peel, the outermost layer, so like the orange part, the actual outer part of the orange, the thing that makes it the orange color, I would consider that the fascia, right? That's that outer, it's the actual outermost covering. But if you were to be able to peel back that orange layer, right below it, there's a membrane, the actual skin of the orange, right? And it's white. It's got a white layer underneath there. I would consider that the epimysium. So when you peel an orange, the outermost layer, I would think would be the epimysium. So that would be like the outermost layer of this muscle. And then each of these orange segments, so those individual segments, I would consider those to be the fascicles. Because the fascicle is a bundle of individual muscle fibers, so this would be like a bundle of orange. So each one of these orange segments has a membrane on the outside, which I would call the perimysium. Okay? Now, not everybody is as crazy as I am, but you may not be aware of this, but there's another layer to an orange. If you were to peel, now this is telling you a little more about me than you might need to know, but I'm a little crazy when it comes to peeling oranges. I got to get all that pith. That white's got to get off of there. I spend some time on an orange. And one of the things you can do with an orange is you can peel that membrane back. And what you will find are these little pouches. They're like little tiny pouches of orange goodness. Each one of these little membrane-bound vessels inside of that segment of an orange is full of the actual orange juice. So you may not be aware of this, but you can peel an orange one more layer down. And each one of those little individual essence of orange juice packets I would consider to be the individual muscle fiber. So that would be an individual muscle cell. And that has a membrane on the outside, which we're going to call the endomysium. So how does that relate to an actual muscle? Well, if you take a look here, this would be the epimysium, the outermost layer underneath the fascia. And then we have our individual bundles of muscle fibers. So each one of these larger bundles would be a fascicle, and this would be the perimysium. Okay? And then if I were to pull one of these individual muscle cells out, so this would be an individual muscle cell here, that would be in the fascicle. This would be the endomysium around that. So those are the major divisions of a muscle fiber. Let's just keep moving through here a little more, and then this will be a good stopping point after this slide. So a couple more things I want to point out to you. So this would be an individual muscle fiber. So this would be the endomysium on the outside. And if you take a look at it, it looks like a long thread, and that's why muscle fibers do look like long threads. If you've ever had pulled pork before, I'm sorry, or pulled chicken, I don't want to ruin anybody's food, but those individual strands that you pull apart, those are the fascicles. So those are the fascicle bundles inside the muscle, and then if you were to pull that strand apart, each little individual tiny, and these would be too small to see, are going to be those muscle cells. So an individual fascicle is made up of thousands of individual muscle cells, which we're looking at right here. And each one of these is a bundled together thing called myofibrils. So let's kind of get into this image here. So what are we looking at? This is a cell, and it doesn't look like a cell, but it's a cell. And it's a cell that has a function, and it's made up of a long, thin strand. So when you think of a cell, you probably think of a blobby thing, but hopefully one of the things you've learned in this class is that all cells look different depending on their jobs, right? So some cells are going to have a blobby appearance, but that's going to be because that's their job. This is going to have a thin, long appearance because its job is to cause movement, and it attaches to two bones. So what are the components of this muscle fiber here? Well, you can see we have the outermost layer, which is going to be the membrane. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The nucleus is in there. There are nuclei inside muscle fibers because it's a cell. And then we have what's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum because sarco refers to muscle. It actually means flesh, but anytime you see sarco or myo, that means muscle. So you can see on the slide alone, it says sarco and myo. That just refers to muscle. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum is just like the endoplasmic reticulum. It is a channel of membrane-bound, essentially hallways or channels that allows for the movement of ions and substances within the cell. So it's just like the endoplasmic reticulum, but because it's in a muscle, we call it the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that is going to be found all around these myofibrils, which is the next thing on the slide. So myofibrils are what make up the majority of a muscle fiber. It is made up of proteins, and these are the proteins that cause contraction, and there's two types, actin and myosin. Actin is the thin filament, and myosin is the thick filament. We're going to talk a lot more about this as we go through, but that's enough for one lecture. Thank you very much.